Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Patrick Van Horn, and I am the founder of the CP Journal and Active Analysis Consulting. Let me start by thanking you all for dialing in today for this webinar. Before we get started, I want to make just one quick note. Where I'm presenting from, we've already lost power once today due to some thunderstorms. So if for some reason we get cut off in the middle of this webinar, it will be re-recorded and posted back up on the site by the end of the day. Also, the slides and speaking notes will be added into the library pages as well, in case we get cut off here. As we start to look at school safety, the topic of school safety is always one that is important, but the recent events that have occurred have certainly raised the level of awareness to new heights, and rightfully so. Because the complexity of school safety presents a set of circumstances for teachers, principals, bus drivers, and local police officers to deal with in order to create truly secure learning environments. There's a lot that goes into actually making sure that happens. The reason I'm going to talk about behavioral analysis is because of the benefit that it can provide when a school's focus is on preventing violence instead of only on how to respond to active shooters. It isn't always easy to maintain this focus because of what happens immediately following a successful attack inside of a school. While the news and media frenzy that occurs after an attack begins brings laser-focused attention to the issue of school security, this interest is oftentimes short-lived and can distract school administrators from making systematic improvements to their school safety plan. After Newtown, the focus became concentrated on political issues such as gun control, which led to a national debate about guns and took the conversation away from how teachers and principals can protect the students inside of their classrooms. The concern over mental health issues is often raised following successful attacks. Conversations about cyberbullying and the challenge that social media presents add in additional layers to the discussion about how to prevent another incident from happening. While these are all absolutely concerns that impact the school's safety, these aren't going to be overnight solutions. These are much larger decisions that, while important, they fail to provide any guidance on what schools can be doing right now to prevent future attacks from happening. These conversations and the demand for immediate results only leads to schools taking reactionary measures, with the end result being increased perception in school safety, while the goal has to be to get beyond only creating a perception and actually ensuring that we have safe learning environments. And this is what we're going to talk about today. So here's what I had planned for this webinar so that we can move school safety along the path of progress and begin enhancing the security measures that you already have put in place. We'll start by going over the two types of threats that schools face, the insider and the outsider. From there, we'll talk about the different elements of an attack and how we are often trained to look for variables that change from situation to situation. But by learning to analyze behavior, we can begin to focus on the one and only one constant that is present in all school attacks. After that, we'll go into an overview of behavioral analysis and talk about the basics of reading individuals, groups of people, understanding how people interact with their surroundings, and the collective mood of everyone present. And finally, we will wrap up by talking about how implementing a program that incorporates behavioral analysis can systematically reduce the degree of risk that your school is exposed to by increasing the level of awareness that your teachers and staff can maintain. As we start by looking at the two types of threats that a school faces and has to consider protecting against, the first are the outsiders. Schools exist to keep outsiders out. Those who don't belong are not allowed in. Outsiders are typically the easier threat to defend against and identify because the person's physical presence alone alerts people to the problem, alerts them to the potential for a threat. This presentation isn't going to really talk about defending against outsiders because when schools or companies make the decision that they want to ensure that no outsiders can get in, the amount of resources available to them in this area are plentiful. There are numerous companies out there that can provide security guards, install bulletproof glass, build access control measures, metal detectors, and create the contingency plans necessary to deal with this type of threat. Because of that, because all those resources are there, I want to focus on the insider. I'm not saying that we should discount the seriousness of the outside threat either. After all, this is the style of the attack that occurred in Newtown. Adam Lanza did not obviously belong at Sandy Hook. The school knew he didn't belong and had measures in place to keep people like him out. Fortunately, he was able to forcibly enter the school as he shot his way in. So even though we're not going to talk about outsiders, it's absolutely a topic that schools need to consider when establishing their security plans. Instead of talking about keeping outsiders out, I want to focus on identifying the more difficult of the two threats, the insider. The insider is often harder to spot for the sole fact that they do belong in that building, and their presence alone does not alert anyone to the potential for violence. They have the ID card, they have the credentials, and a legitimate reason for being there, making early detection a challenge to a school who's trying to make sure a student hasn't brought a gun in their backpack into school. While detecting these threats can be more difficult, it also provides the opportunity to intervene proactively. Once we know what to look for, because the insider oftentimes is going to conceal his intentions in order to get further into the school, their actions to conceal what they intend to do will cause them to stand out from the crowd. To highlight the complexity of insider attacks and school safety in general, I want to talk real briefly about T.J. Lane and the attack that he launched on the students in Chardon High School. On February 27th, 2012, 17-year-old T.J. Lane was seated in the cafeteria. It was around 7:30 in the morning, just as the school day was beginning and kids were entering the school cafeteria for their breakfast. Even though he was a resident of the school district area, he didn't go to Chardon High School. He was instead enrolled at Lake Academy, which is a school for reluctant learners. Even though he was familiar with the school and known by many of the students who went there, who were classmates earlier on in his life, he was an outsider. He did not belong inside the school, yet no one brought it up to anyone's attention that he was there. He went unnoticed until he pulled a Ruger .22 caliber revolver out and opened fire on students inside the cafeteria. Ultimately, he killed 3 students and wounded 3 more before fleeing from the school. He's now serving 3 consecutive life sentences, but he's yet to offer even a possible reason or motive for his attack. I use T.J. Lane as an example because his story is not unique when it comes to school violence. Even though he was an outsider, he went undetected inside the school, and it presents the same challenge to teachers and principals and school staff trying to protect against the insider. These insiders were able to conceal their intentions and weapons long enough to get deeper into the school and conduct these attacks in a classroom, cafeteria, residence halls, auditoriums, and the other places we've seen lately. And even just looking at recent history, this is very similar to the Virginia Tech attack in April of 2007. It's very similar to Northern Illinois University, where Stephen Kazmierczak killed 6 and wounded 21 more in February of 2008. It's similar to Columbine when Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold made their way into the cafeteria. This last January, just a few months ago, at Taft Union High School, and Brian Oliver wounded 2, making his way into the school that he belonged in. Same thing last August, at Perry Hall High School in Baltimore, where Robert Gladden wounded 1 person in an attack at his high school. These 6 are just a few of the many attacks that have occurred in recent history in the U.S. from insiders. Students, teachers, staff, anyone who belongs in that school can make it difficult for people to recognize when they intend to harm others. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, if we're going to get past just creating a perception of security and installing the bulletproof glass and the access control systems, we need to be capable of defending against the insider just as much as we are preparing to stop the outsider. Because these individuals are not going to be identified by simply being in the building, we need to understand what type of indicators they will give off and what teachers and school staff and security providers need to be aware of. What is going to make the difference between spotting these potential attackers and missing them comes down to looking for the right cues. And oftentimes, we're trained to look for the wrong cues when it comes to recognizing threats. A lot of classes and a lot of programs that exist teach people how to look for the variables that are present in an attack. As the name implies, variables are factors that change from attack to attack, making them unreliable indicators of potential violence. We're not going to be able to prevent violence by focusing on the victim. Oftentimes there's no pattern and no relationship between the shooter and the victim. We also can't prevent violence by looking for one set profile for the shooter. They could be of any race, any gender, religion, age. None of those factors can lead directly to a person deciding to commit violence. We can't focus only on the cause or the motive. Not every kid who gets bullied comes back with a gun in his backpack. Not every child or student who comes from a broken home decides to commit violence. So only looking at set characteristics about the motive, the cause, whether it's anger, rage, or embarrassment, those aren't going to allow us to really prevent violence from occurring. And finally, we can't prevent violence by focusing on the method. Even though many of these instances were with guns, Columbine, the attackers used bombs as well. T.J. Lane brought a knife with them into the attack. And even if security was so tight that no outside weapons were able to get into a school, the amount of weapons of opportunity that you could find in a school classroom are very high. So because of this, we're not going to focus on any of these 5 indicators when it comes to recognizing people who intend to hurt others. If we see something from this, we're not going to ignore it, but these aren't going to be the initial observations that we're going to make about the people that are around us. Instead of focusing on the variables, we are going to focus on the one and only one constant that occurs in every single attack, and that is the person's intent to harm others. None of these attacks were an accident. Every single one of them, the person intended to kill someone else. Preventing the active shooter often comes down to making 2 very important assessments about other people. Does the person intend to harm others, and are they capable of acting on those intentions? Preventing violence from occurring means that we need to improve our ability to assess the intentions of people and quickly separate out who's there with a legitimate purpose and who's there to harm others. One of the questions that I often get is this possible? Is this something that we can learn how to do? And the answer is absolutely. We're going to do it by using what's called behavioral analysis. And just so we're all on the same page about the type of behavior that I'm talking about, we are going to look at the assessments, or we're going to make assessments of the uncontrollable elements of behavior that reveal a person's intentions and capabilities. This is important because it allows us to observe each and every single person that we come into contact with throughout the day. This is different than if you look at the Department of Homeland Security's indicators of potential violence. You'll see things on that list that talk about a person with marital problems or substance abuse problems or financial problems. The problem with those types of indicators is that it requires a very personal level of detail about the people that you know for you to even begin assessing them as a potential threat. If you even just think about the number of people in your life that would confide that detailed amount of information to you, you realize that it's going to be extremely limiting. This is the equivalent of a school needing to know what parents are going through a divorce, which parents have guns in their home, how accessible those guns are, which kids are getting bullied outside of school or online, which students have older siblings who might be using drugs. These indicators are very difficult to come by, and again, just like the variables we talked about on the last slide, they're not always a true representation of what that person is going to do. we're not going to ignore them, if they do get presented to us, but we're not going to rely on them either. So the goal of behavioral analysis is to provide us the ability to analyze everyone that's around us on a city sidewalk, people that we've never met before, and anywhere that we go in the world. The second thing that we're going to talk about with behavioral analysis are that all of the observations we are going to make come from applied behavioral science. If we're going to make observations that lead to decisions that we can be confident in, they have to be valid. Oftentimes, after shootings, there's usually at least one person that says, I saw the person before he did anything. I thought that something was off, but I wasn't sure, and I didn't want to make the situation any worse. Because observing behavior isn't a muscle that we exercise very frequently, we can sometimes doubt ourselves when it does come to a conscious level of awareness. But since everything that we are looking at and everything we're talking about here are applications that come from numerous fields of science, we can attain a higher degree of confidence that's required to prevent these attacks from occurring. The other benefit of using science is that it provides us a terminology where we'll be able to communicate very specifically what we're seeing and what caused us to focus our attention on a specific person. What we're going to talk about here is an evolution of the Marine Corps' Combat Hunter program. This is a program that I worked in while I was on active duty in the Marines, and it was originally designed to give Marines the ability to recognize threats and identify insurgents who were hiding in a crowded marketplace overseas. We needed the ability to pick out an enemy who wore civilian clothes and blended in with everyone around them. The program that we're going to talk about here, it's been adopted to meet the needs and uniqueness of this civilian environment. I'm not talking about teaching schools combat tactics or anything like that. We're just talking about the same ability to recognize people who intend to harm others. And most importantly, it is not racial or religious profiling, or include anything with mental health assessments. Those indicators alone are inaccurate. They don't lead a person to violence, what a person's skin color is or what their beliefs are. And the mental health assessments is something that is still developing and has yet to provide a real clear indicator of what a person intends to do. All of these elements all drive to support one very clear purpose, and that goal is to get teachers and schools and principals left of bang. When I say get left of bang, I want you to imagine a timeline that represents the steps that a person has to go through in order to commit attack. Bang is in the exact middle of the timeline. All right? Everything that occurs left of bang is what the attacker had to do before he could launch his attack. Getting the gun, deciding to commit the act, conducting surveillance, conducting a rehearsal. If we can intervene during any of those steps, we have the ability to prevent the act from occurring. Being right of bang is reactionary. It is all the things we do once the attack has begun. It is when the SWAT team has to come into the school and when we execute our contingency plans and we go into lockdown drills. Those are all right of bang actions. Everything that we're talking about, the goal is to prevent these violent acts from occurring and to get left of bang. I see there's a couple questions that have come in. If you have questions, please send them over. And at the end of the presentation, I'll go through and answer anything that might come up with those. There are 4 pillars of behavior. There are 4 different ways that we can look at and assess the people and the environment that provide us the information needed to do this. We're going to start by looking at and assessing individual people. This is going to determine their current emotional state. This is where we can start to assign classifications to a person's intentions and how they're feeling at that moment. We put these individuals into groups to develop a better understanding of the relationship of the members within that clique, identify who the leaders and the influencers are inside of those group dynamics. From there, we're going to put individuals and groups into the context of the environment to determine if people are familiar or unfamiliar with their surroundings, and to better predict what actions people are going to take when they arrive in a new area. And finally, we're going to look at the collective mood of everyone present to determine how safe they feel and to better understand the common emotions of the area as a whole. So we're going to start by looking at individual behavior. What we're talking about here is really being able to quickly and accurately read specific people, and this is really the basis and foundation of any behavioral approach, whether we're talking threat recognition or becoming a better teacher or even a more astute sales consultant. Being able to look at the person across from you or look at the people around you and make accurate assessments about their current state of mind. We're going to look at primarily a person's body language, while there is other factors that could go into this. We're going to look at the nonverbal communication that's displayed through their lower body, the legs, the feet, analyze a person's torso, their hands, their arms, their shoulders, their face, to a lesser extent their face. And we're going to use that information to group them into what we refer to as clusters. We use clusters of 3 or more indicators to make an assessment about a person because a single gesture does not have one and only one possible meaning. If you were to look at the guy here in this picture, he might be standing with his arms crossed because he is closed off. He might be uncomfortable. He might be annoyed. He might be comfortable. That might be just how he checks his watch. He might have a broken collarbone and trying to support his shoulder or something like that. But there are a ton of assessments that can be made from looking at only one gesture or posture. So we're not going to rely on that to make accurate decisions. We're going to look for 3 or more cues that lead us all to the same conclusion about what a person's body language is communicating. So when we have 3 cues, we will have enough information that allows us to assign them to one of our clusters. We can assign every single person we meet into one of 4 different clusters. A person can be either acting dominant or submissive or uncomfortable or comfortable. We use these terms because in situations where you are trying to identify potential threats, there isn't enough time to look at each person and say, well, their feet are doing this and their hands are doing this and their torso is doing this for everyone around you. That is much too slow of a process. By grouping gestures into clusters, we can quickly assess what the entire body is displaying and quickly communicate it by saying, this person is dominant, this person is uncomfortable. Everyone in that group appears to be comfortable. This speeds up the process of observing and analyzing without losing the accuracy of an observation. And this is very important, is not only to make these classifications, but also to understand the terminology. Again, this all comes from a number of scientific studies that support the actual gestures and individual pieces that make up these clusters, but also to use the cluster name themselves for communicating. If you were to take 4 people and ask them to describe someone that we call dominant, someone might use the word aggressive, someone else might use the word posturing, someone else might say he's puffing himself up, and by using the word dominant, it facilitates communication. So a person who's out front of a school who's looking at students getting off the bus and approaching the front of the school, they can quickly communicate why they focus their attention on one specific student using terminology that keeps everyone on the same page. Before I show pictures of people displaying each of the 4 clusters, I want to quickly touch on where these gestures and postures originate from. All of our body language, whether it's controlled consciously or unconsciously, is guided by our brain. And I don't want to spend an excessive amount of time on this because this could fill an entire hour in itself. But these clusters that we're looking at are a manifestation of the signal sent to our body by the limbic system of our brain. The limbic system is our survival center. This is what initiates the freeze, flight, or fight response that many people are familiar with. This is how we deal with stressful situations, by ceasing all movement, by getting out of the situation or preparing to fight our way out. The limbic system is constantly searching our surroundings for things that may harm us. And when a threat is perceived, this is the part of our brain that sends a signal to our body and guides our initial reaction to whatever it is that we just saw. The response that our limbic system generates is unconscious and uncontrollable. So this is what's going to make sure our observations are both reliable and honest indicators about what a person is perceiving at that time. It's also going to provide us with the reason for each of the clusters. So as we look at the first two clusters that we talked about, dominant behavior and submissive behavior, dominant behavior is determined by the space that a person is taking up. This is where posturing comes into play because that is a territorial display. Dominance is the manifestation of the fight response to stress. A person who will usually puff themselves up before they get into a fight, take up more space in an attempt to intimidate another person into submission. Submissive behavior is the exact opposite. Whereas dominant behavior is the fight response, submissive behavior is the absence of the fight response. It's characterized by people who try to make themselves look smaller. They'll retract their arms into their body. They'll pull their legs in, maybe tuck them underneath their chair, and doing all these things to make themselves look smaller. Sometimes you see this in abused children when the abuser is around them. They make themselves small as if they're trying to make sure that they avoid being seen, avoid angering the person, and they do it as a survival mechanism. So dominance is making oneself larger, and submissiveness is making oneself smaller. As you look at these pictures, they all show just simple examples of dominance. Putting your hands on your hips, placing your feet shoulder width apart, using exaggerated hand gestures to take up the space in front of you, or puffing up your chest. Yelling at someone is essentially using your voice to control and command a larger amount of the space by talking over others. It's the same way that invading the personal space of someone else is used to show that you're in charge. Oftentimes, if we're looking at rage-fueled attacks or where someone is very emotional, the signs of dominance will present themselves because the body, again, is preparing for fight and using their body language to begin communicating what their intentions are. On the opposite side of dominance, we have the submissive cluster. Compare the examples in the last slide to the children you see in these pictures. When a person is acting submissively, they take up less space. The girl in the picture on the left with her shoulders lowered and her hands drawn into her body, that's making herself look smaller. In the top right, when people sometimes wrap their feet around the legs of their chair, this is often done as if they're seeking stability and trying to regain control and composure. It helps prevent excessive movement, but also fits into the category of making oneself smaller. I'm sure there's some people who say, well, I do that when I'm uncomfortable. Again, that's just one indicator. We're always going to look for 3 or more to make that cluster, but that's just one example. When we look at uncomfortable and comfortable behavior, I'm always asking myself, has a flight response been generated by the body? For the uncomfortable cluster, we're looking at behavior that indicates either distancing or blocking, both of which are used to essentially protect the body by either 1, covering up, or 2, just getting the body away from the situation that might be perceived as threatening. A person who is acting uncomfortable will often be exhibiting signs that you might otherwise refer to as anxious or agitated or nervous. When your body is reacting to a stressful situation with the flight response, you're physically generating energy to get yourself out of there. This energy has to go somewhere, especially in modern society where not every time you perceive a threat you're going to get up and sprint out of the room. But the brain is still going to generate the same response. This is what leads to what's often referred to as pacifying behavior, maybe when you're rubbing your hands together or maybe rubbing the bridge of your nose, but doing something with your hands or your feet where you're trying to calm yourself back down. When we observe this behavior, it's showing us the person has perceived something as a challenge to them, whether, that could be along the spectrum of threats from, potential to be killed to someone challenging their credibility or just a mild annoyance about the situation that they find themselves in. So distancing and blocking, that's what we're looking for when we're assessing uncomfortable cues. And then the fourth cluster is, someone who is comfortable. A person who is feeling comfortable does not perceive any threat to their survival. What you might otherwise refer to as being relaxed or lounging. They're in no position to defend themselves should a threat arise. Comfortable cues show the absence of any freeze, flight, or fight response to stress because there is no perceived danger. If you were to look at the person, the guy in the right picture with his foot up on the wall, if you were to send a stranger walking past him, someone who he did not know and did not know was safe, you'd probably see him shift his foot off the wall into something other than the comfortable cluster until he was sure that there was no threat to him. So let's take a couple look at pictures from the uncomfortable cluster. The top two are what we refer to as that distancing behavior, where the body has generated energy. The girl in the top left picture, you see her biting her nails. In the top right, the girl fidgeting with the ring on her finger. Those all indicate that they are nervous and they're trying to calm themselves down because they're unsure of the situation. The bottom two pictures are examples of just distancing or blocking behavior. The boy in the bottom right corner has literally backed himself against a wall, creating as much distance as possible from whatever's causing that discomfort. And the girl in the bottom left picture, you see her leaning away. It's subtle, but she's attempting to distance herself from whatever the kid's got in the jar there. These are just quick examples that show some of the uncomfortable cues. Obviously, these are just one moment in time as well. The girl in the top right might have just had an itch on her finger. But in real life, we're not looking at still images and would have much more information to classify each of these people. But these are the basics of the uncomfortable cluster. All the people shown in this slide are demonstrating comfortable behavior. This is oftentimes what my baseline is and what is normal for people. They are relaxed. They're engaging with whatever's in front of them. They're not concerned about any possible threats. More often than not, when people are familiar with their surroundings, you'll see them in the comfortable cluster because we don't live our lives just expecting threats to arise. So we should see people in the comfortable cluster most of the time. These four clusters of behavior, these are ways that we can categorize every single person that we observe, and they are mutually exclusive. A person cannot be dominant and uncomfortable. He or she will fall into one of the clusters or another. But the clusters are just the beginning of the process and certainly not the end state. They should be considered more of the science behind the observations and accurate ways to categorize the emotions, the postures, and the gestures of those that we come into contact with. Throughout the day, people will naturally cycle through all four of these clusters, and labeling someone one way or another does not make them a criminal or make them a potential attacker. It is simply an observed fact. To provide these observations with greater meaning, we need to understand the context that surrounds the person we're looking at. This will let us know when the person fits our baseline, therefore becoming a person who does not require any further attention, and will also let us know when someone stands out in what we refer to as an anomaly, a person that requires a decision and some type of action to be taken. What's important is that everything starts with the baseline. If we don't know what's normal in the environment or the setting that we find ourselves in, we will never be able to identify the person trying to conceal their violent intentions. It leads us to use a very simple formula to structure all of the information that we're receiving and all of the observations that we're making. We refer to this as baseline plus anomaly equals decision. The first step that we require is that we define what is normal. Once we know what's expected here, we can now begin actively searching the people around us to see who stands out. And once we identify one of those anomalies, one of those deviations from the baseline, we now can make a decision about how to proceed and how we can interact with this person before something comes up. So think about the baseline that you would establish for a classroom. Oftentimes, people only consider the physical objects that are present. They'll bring up the tables, the chairs, the desks, a computer, projector, teachers, students, a whiteboard, etc. But a baseline goes much further than only the physical objects that are there, and needs to include observations about the teacher's behavior. Does the teacher teach in a dominant manner or a submissive manner when they are presenting a new concept? Is their energy level very high, or are they very lethargic when they teach? There's a number of ways that we can use to categorize that teacher to understand what is normal in that room. We can also assess the behavior for the students. Are they comfortable or are they uncomfortable in class? Are they paying attention or are they drifting off? I found that many teachers typically have a very thorough understanding of the individual baseline for each of their students. Because they see them every day, they have learned the subtleties of each student, and when prompted, can provide a very detailed description of the baseline behavior for students, the groups and the cliques and the collective mood of the classroom, depending on even to the extent of the time of the day that the students are in the room. The more thorough that this baseline can be established and defined, the easier it is going to become to identify the changes. And that is what the goal is. Once we know it's normal, anytime that baseline changes, anytime something presents itself that causes a deviation, those are the observations that we need to make so that we can identify, or we know when we have to take some sort of action. The baseline that you establish for the different areas of a school, for example, are defined using each of the 4 pillars of observable behavior that we brought up before. And just because of the time of the webinar, there's not time to go through how to look at groups and the environment and the collective. But there's a white paper that you can download if you're interested in learning more about each of the different sections. If you go to cp-journal.com/library, that's cp-journal.com/library, you'll find a white paper there that explains in a little more detail the science behind each of the observations, as well as the 4 ways that we can observe and classify behavior. So we study and analyze each of these 4 areas of behavior because we're never going to be completely sure what type of observation is going to alert us to a potential threat. In one situation, it might be a student who is demonstrating excessive cues from the uncomfortable cluster while walking into the school one morning when everyone else is exhibiting the normal, comfortable behavior. In another situation, it might be a student who is normally outgoing, loud, engaging, but now is not participating when the classroom of students is becoming excited and is conveying emotions that don't fit the collective mood of the room. Another situation might be a student who is avoiding a group of friends that she normally hangs out with, demonstrating submissive cues to avoid being seen by them. At this point in the observation and the analysis process, we don't yet know why they are acting that way. All that we know is that by defining the baseline for what is normal and understanding the context that surrounds it, we can begin to focus on the behavior, the people, and the situations that are deviating. We will talk about how we will find that cause and that trigger in just a second. But the first step and the most important step of this whole process is realizing that something is different and that something has changed. Each one of these observable pillars of behavior should be thought of as a lens that we can see through. We're never sure which lens is going to provide the information, whether it's an assessment of an individual or how someone's approaching the building or how they're engaging with their friends. So we have to continually think about and train ourselves to understand each of them as thoroughly as possible so that we can make the intuitive and fast decisions that are required in threat recognition and active shooter scenarios. So as we mentioned, the formula is what's going to allow us to recognize those who intend to harm others. Whether the person's behavior is extreme dominance, which would likely be seen in the example of outsider attacks, or excessive discomfort, or submissiveness if a person is attempting to conceal their intentions in order to avoid detection. These are all the observations that are available to us when we know the specific behavior that makes these clusters up. Finding anomalies, though, isn't just going to slap us in the face. We're going to have to go out there and actively search for them. It is a conscious process and something that requires dedicated attention. But once the anomaly is identified, what's important is that you must make a decision and you must take action. We're not making observations for the sake of observations, but to provide the information needed to make intelligent decisions about what proactive steps we can take. I'm not going to talk too much about decisions here because looking at the sign-up form, we have a wide variety of professionals who tuned in today from a variety of fields. And how a police officer responds is going to be different than how a school security officer responds, which is going to be different than how a principal responds, which is all going to be different than how a teacher responds to an observation. But there's one decision that is pretty much standard regardless of your profession, and that is what we refer to as the contact. Once we recognize that someone's behavior does not fit the baseline, the only way that we can confirm our observation is by talking to the person. If a teacher observes a student approaching the school entrance and is exhibiting extreme discomfort, that may be because they have a gun in their backpack and are nervous about getting caught, or it could mean that they have a test at the beginning of the day that they're unprepared for and they didn't study for. The behaviors would look exactly the same, but the cause is different. One is legitimate and one is not. This conversation that the teacher has with that student, that uncomfortable student, does not have to be intrusive, but can simply be a teacher asking the student how he is doing today and seeing how he responds. Did the discomfort become more extreme as the authority figure approached, or did he become more comfortable because someone noticed and he can ask for an extension or whatever is needed? This is especially important when working with teenagers. Remember that the behaviors we are observing all originate from the limbic system. In addition to being our survival center, it's also our brain's emotional center. I'm sure some of those listening in who have teenage kids of their own or who work with them frequently see the complexity of this, since kids are inherently emotional and can change moods in a split second. Because most of these shifts are completely normal and can be expected, we can't respond with aggressive force or kind of in-your-face conversations every time something comes up on our radar. Tact is important when having this conversation to try to figure out what is causing that discomfort, what is causing the person to be acting so dominant today, what happened at home last night that has caused these children to act submissively while in public. This is how we're going to distinguish between the student, who just got embarrassed by his friends and has the ability to cope with that anger, and those who are so enraged by the attack that they're so enraged that they're going to attack back without really caring about the consequences. This is where being proactive and enhanced security comes from, the active participation and awareness of everyone involved. Everything that I'm saying here, it's not designed to replace anything else that you're already doing in your respective schools. The intent is to complement those measures. So if your school is already using physical control measures designed to keep the outsider out, that is great because it creates the perception of authority, which in the eyes of a potential attacker will be seen as a stressor. It will help elicit the behavior that we can observe and use to separate the attacker from the crowd that he hides amongst. What I'm talking about here are educational controls so that teachers and school staff and bus drivers have the ability and the informed awareness to create a safe learning environment. And as we wrap this up, I just want to bring up the different levels of awareness that people experience throughout the day. I like to use, it's called Cooper's Color Code as a model for this, which was developed by Marine Lieutenant Colonel Jeff Cooper. He created a terminology for us to use and explain 5 different states of awareness which highlight the relationship between being proactive and reactive when it comes to threat recognition. On the low end of the spectrum, you have condition white, which is a person who's relaxed and unaware of their surroundings. These are the people walking down the street with their face buried in the cell phone. They are not looking around. They're the ones who just walk into traffic. Should a threat arise, a person in condition white would be completely unprepared to deal with that threat because they had no advanced warning at all. From condition white, we escalate to condition yellow, which we refer to as a relaxed alert. This is a person who knows that there's threats out there somewhere, is actively looking for them, but hasn't found anything specific to focus on just yet. From yellow, we escalate up to condition orange. This is what we refer to as a specified alert. They have found something specific that stands out, and they've begun creating the plan in their head for how they're going to deal with that threat. From orange, we escalate to condition red, which is, it says in the fight, but we're talking about just executing the plan and taking the action that we created in condition orange. And then at the far end of the spectrum, we have condition black, which is no situational awareness. It's the same as condition white, but just for different reasons. The stress of the situation has become so extreme that the person has experienced complete mental, physical breakdown and is no longer analyzing their surroundings. The reason I bring up these 5 different conditions is because of the relationship between yellow, orange, and red. If a person does not know what to look for or what causes someone to be classified as a potential threat, they will never shift into condition orange. They will go from looking for threats to immediately responding and reacting to the shooter without any advanced warning. This is very reactionary. If the only thing that a person knows to look for that makes someone a threat is to visually see a weapon, all right, they're never going to have that advanced warning because by the time the weapon is presented, we're no longer going into a planning phase. We are just responding and reacting to whatever that shooter has done. On the other hand, when a person is trained to identify individuals who stand out from the baseline by recognizing the subtle cues and identifying people with violent intentions, they create the opportunity to be proactive. This allows them to shift into condition orange just by recognizing someone who stands out from the baseline. And they can begin developing a plan for how they're going to deal with that threat or how they can confirm that what they saw, yes, this person intends to harm others, or no, this person is uncomfortable for legitimate reason. All right? This is where we get the opportunity to take action before an event. And the reason I bring this up, especially at the end of the presentation, is because I know many of the people listening are in the security field. And while you're trained to be constantly alert and assessing your surroundings, you can only be in one place at a time. And as you assess the security of your school or your workplace or wherever you are, you have to ask yourself, are the teachers in your schools trained to know what to look for? Are the bus drivers? Is the rest of the staff? If they aren't, as a school as a whole, you're going to lose the ability to shift into condition orange at an early enough time to prevent that attack from occurring. And so as I look at how a person goes and how a person learns how to do this well, there are typically about 4 milestones that a person goes through when learning about behavioral analysis. The first is just the understand the need to employ behavioral analysis, which is what we talked about here. From just understanding the need, a person's got to learn how to observe and how to assess the people around them. This usually comes in the form of classroom training. There are some resources on the web that I'll talk about in a second that can help with this. But this is kind of the science behind the observations. It's pretty static, and it's learning how to analyze pictures or small or short video clips. After you have down just the basics, you can now start to look at making these assessments in unscripted scenarios, but in specific locations, usually the locations that a person was taught how to do them in. The example of school violence, if a teacher learns how to read behavior in the setting of a classroom, they'll be able to do that pretty quickly and pretty easily. But there's going to be a few limitations when they try to make those observations in the grocery store or the mall or the movie theater or the restaurant, wherever they are, when they're not at school. And that is the fourth level, usually the fourth milestone that we look at. The people who have developed their understanding of behavior and can apply the principles wherever they go. To support this entire process, to help people progress along this path, my company provides training to support that learning in two different forms. The first is the Tactical Analysis Program. This is designed for military, law enforcement, and security professionals. But we also apply the same observations that we take to train Marines before they deploy and work with schools and workplaces, companies, and churches. The public is just as much at risk of dealing with the active shooter because the events are so quick that the police or security professionals are. So there's those resources there that are really designed to take someone through those first couple steps to make observations using behavior and apply them in the setting that is important to them. However, no matter who is teaching a course, no one is going to become an expert in anything after just a couple classes or a few days learning to read behavior. It's important, in my opinion, to have the resources available to continuously practice and develop your skills to achieve mastery in any skill. And so for those looking to become more capable of observing and assessing and communicating behavior in whatever setting you find yourself in, we do provide this online resource as well, cp-journal.com. Many of you are aware of it already because it's where you signed up for the webinar, but there's a lot of free articles and free videos on the site. And for those who have subscribed to the journal, there's a higher quality of resources as well as development videos. We put videos up each week so people can practice making observations in different settings. Grand Central Station, there's a clip from a food court. There's one right now up about Starbucks. There's one coming up about reading behavior through videos in a movie theater, assessing the people that are around you. It just provides the setting to continue your learning. And so that is the presentation. I'm about to open it up for some questions that people might have. So if you do have a question, there is that questions tab. You can click on it and fill out whatever question you have. But here's my contact information. So before we wrap up the webinar, take this down. If a question comes up after you get offline, you're thinking about this later, send me an email. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have. A recording of this webinar will be available on the CP-Journal website, and a transcript with the slides, the slide deck, and the speaking notes will be added into the library page on CP Journal as well. So before I turn over the questions, thank you again for tuning in today. Make sure you check back in a couple weeks. We'll have the topic for our monthly webinar in July determined. But let me see what we got here. There's a question here. It says that there are individual investigations, but broad assessments of a population may require some sort of notification or tip-off. The Hunter Awareness Program may just be for recognition and immediate threats. It provides both. By learning to read behavior, so what the question's asking is, to what extent did the Combat Hunter Program the Marines created, essentially what did it support? And there were two goals for it. One was to make Marines more survivable. So the initial purpose was very clear, and it was to make Marines, give them the ability to recognize threats so they could become more safe while overseas. But it was also to improve their operational effectiveness as well. So the indicators that we talked about here, those focus solely on the threat side. They can also be used to target criminal, insurgent, and terrorist networks more effectively as well. By learning to read behavior, we can look at groups of people, start to identify who the key leaders of an area are, whether it's a village overseas or someone who's influential in a group of friends. So if we need to do intelligence collection, we can start to better assess who has the information on specific people, who can we target to go after to find those sources and perhaps get those tips from, instead of just maybe sitting back and waiting for those. It provides the information that we need to kind of go out and start to target people a little bit more effectively with the information that we're after. Long answer is that it supported two goals. One was to make Marines more safe, and the other was to increase our ability to find the insurgents and the insurgent leadership as well. There's another question. The training and focus appears to be on the signals immediate prior to the assault. Is that right? Such as the perp's behavior earlier that day or in their approach. Absolutely. Or can this be applied for the days and weeks before when the assailant is formulating their plan? Both. The number of cues that will be available will be more intense, and the quantity will be higher when a person is in their approach. If they've already committed a violence, they have the weapon tucked into their waistband or in their backpack, because there will now be threats, or there now will be consequences for their action. If they get caught, going from their home to their school, and they're pulled over by a police officer who finds that weapon they've concealed, there are now going to be consequences for that. And as soon as there are those consequences, that is what's going to elicit the response that will be observable. We'll see that a police officer will see that, my baseline for a car stop or traffic stop is mild discomfort when a person is being approached by the police officer. In this case where it's a student who's concealed a weapon, it might be more extreme. But at the same time, we can expand, we can go further in these clusters as well. We also can look at the degree of interest that people are, focusing on, or the amount of interest they have in what they're focusing on. So as we look at the planning phase, when an attacker is conducting surveillance and reconnaissance, it might be, what their attention is focused on. Are they taking pictures of a building that's a beautiful building that tourists, typically are attracted to, but are they taking pictures of the loading docks and security cameras and front door instead of the building itself? If you put into it, you put that presence of authority, you have a police officer on scene, even if they're conducting surveillance, it may elicit a response, but it may not. I know one of the concerns about the TSA SPOT program is that known terrorists have flown through the airport and their behavioral detection officers have not caught them, and that would be a difficult assumption or assessment to make, because that terrorist, if he doesn't have anything that he's going to get in trouble for, if he has a legitimate ticket, he doesn't have a bomb or any weapon on him, he's not going to elicit that response. So it depends on how nervous and how much of a threat they perceive getting caught. And oftentimes with kids or students, I probably shouldn't say kids, but people who are younger, less experienced, they're probably going to perceive the consequences of getting caught higher than some experienced criminal who's kind of worked the system a little bit before. So long answer to a simple question. It works in both the approach and the planning phase as well. Someone asked about if you could have the slides. Absolutely. They'll be posted in about probably give me about an hour to get them up. But if you go to cp-journal.com/library, you can get that's where the slides will be kept. So you can go up there and you can download them. You get the slides as well as the comments that go with the pictures as well. All right. Any last call for questions? All right, again, you've got my contact information on the screen. If something comes up after, please send me an email. I appreciate you guys tuning in today, and I thank you for your time.